Well, welcome everybody. You may have noticed that Sam Liebens is not here. Sadly, there was a timing and flight change conflict. And so Rabbi Dr. Samuel Liebens will not be joining us, but instead we have a Parashah class with Rabbi David Silber. So I will be sharing sources on the screen as we go. Please keep yourself on mute while you're not talking. As you come in, I will invite you to be a panelist, which means you can turn your camera on so we can see your lovely smiles, or you can unmute yourself to ask questions or comments when Rabbi Silber invites them. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can put your comments and your questions as a Facebook comment, and I'll bring them to the chat. Yes, I'll be sharing on screen, but if you want to follow along in your Chumash, the Parashah is via Kel. And with that, I will pass it over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, very good. I'm a last minute pinch hitter here. I just shortly, a little while ago, found out it was just a glitch. And Sam, unfortunately, Dr. Leibniz couldn't work it out, unfortunately. So I would try to pinch hit for him. I don't know exactly what he does, but I would try to. I know it's called Midrash on the Parashah, so I'll try to be in the spirit of Dr. Leibniz's class. Hopefully, he's back next week, and things will get back to normal. Okay, so the Parashah is interesting. This week's Parashah, I didn't check if it's one Parashah or two. I believe it's usually two Parashiyot. Is Vayakel and Pekudei. Now, Vayakel and Pekudei are very much a repeat of Truma and Tetzaveh. I mean, they're quite similar. It's almost word for word a repetition of Truma and Tetzaveh. Truma and Tetzaveh are about the commands to build the Mishkan. Truma focuses essentially on the vessels of the Mishkan, beginning with the vessels of the Mishkan, and Tetzaveh focuses on mostly on the big day kahuna, on the garments that the priest and the high priest wears when performing the service. And then, quite amazingly, we have basically a repeat performance after the first few verses of Vayakel, which are about the Shabbat. We jump right into the actual construction of the Mishkan. Now, the person in charge of building the Mishkan is named Bezalel. And Bezalel is mentioned both in the initial building of the Mishkan. Back in chapter 31, God has chosen Bezalel to build the Mishkan. This week's parashah, we have Bezalel reappearing. This is found in chapter 35. I'll read you the verses, beginning at verse number 30 of chapter 35. Vayomer Moshe el bnei Yisrael, Re'u, Kara Hashem b'Shem, Bezalel ben Uri ben Hur l'matei Yehuda. So see here, God has chosen Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, from the tribe of Judah. And God has filled him with the Spirit of God, Ruach Elohim, wisdom, insight, knowledge in all work. Machshavot, לעשות בזהב ובכסף ובנחושת ובחרושת אבן, למרות ובחרושת עץ, לעשות בכל מלאכת מחשבת. And God has given him inspired him perhaps to make designs for work in gold, silver, copper, cut stones for setting, carve wood, to work in every kind of designer's craft. And to give directions. Together with Eliyahu, the son of Achisamach from the tribe of Dan. He has a helper, an assistant. God has filled them with wisdom. לעשות כל מלאכת חרוש וחושב, רוקם והפלט והגמן, תולת השני ושש ויורג, עושה כל מלאכה, וחושבי מחשבות. They are the designers, the embroiderers, workers in all crafts, makers of designs. Now that's what the Torah says here about Bezalel. And one thing that I think strikes us immediately when we read these verses, which describe the chief architect of the Mishkan and the and his assistant architect, and there are many others who also participate, because the Mishkan was built primarily through voluntary contributions, voluntary work, etc. Men and women both who construct the Mishkan, but the main person in charge is Betzalel with Eliyav. And what is very interesting here, before we get to any kind of Midrash, is that there's a big focus over here. I would say the idea of wisdom. First of all, the word Chachma appears in verse number 31. Tevuna and Dat. Chachma, Tevuna, and Dat. In fact, those who pray in the Sephardic rite, or even Nusach Sfard, Hasidic, most Hasidim Nusach Sfard, then the first blessing of the Shmona Esrei, the intermediate blessings of the Shmona Esrei, Chachma, Bina, Vadat. So Chabad gets its name. Chachma, Bina, Vadat. And Chachma, Bina, and Dat are three different words that describe presumably three different elements of wisdom. It's the first blessing in the Shemona Esrei. The Ashkenazim have Deya, Bina, and Haskel, which is interesting. Deya, Bina, those two words are the same. And we have Haskel. But Deya, Bina, and Haskel, we don't have Chachma. But basically, it's the first request we make. We want insight, we want wisdom, even to know what to ask for. So that's one thing. And then we have also two other terms here in the text. One is lachshov machshavot. Machshavot is a thought, to think thoughts. And finally, we have another word, very striking word, lahorot natan belibo. Lahorot is to teach, to instruct. So it's interesting. The job is, this is the engineer who's making the vessels of the Mishkan. Now, the actual, one might say the blueprints, the actual measure and all that, that's dictated by God. I mean, but nonetheless, it appears that Betzalel, that the artisans have their own contribution to make. It's actually it's very interesting that in the building of the Mishkan, even though the measurements are given and all that, but there's something else curious about the Parashah of the Mishkan. And that is not just that the measurements are given, but one of the phrases that appears and reappears throughout the Mishkan is, God says to Moshe, you should build it kasher horeita bahar, the way I showed you. Several different tamor bahar, several different times in the description of the vessels of the Mishkan, God says to Moshe, you should build it the way you were shown. One even gets the sense that Moshe is taken perhaps up in heaven. There's a heavenly temple. There's a heavenly temple up there. And Moshe, a dozen, maybe God personally or a dozen, is taking Moshe around. And you see the menorah, that's the way you build it. You see the shulchan, that's the way you build it, etc. But the idea to build it the way you see it, as opposed to just follow the instructions, suggests that the Torah wants to emphasize there is some human element over here as well, apart from simply following instructions. There's some human dimension to the Mishkan. And certainly one gets that sense because of the emphasis in the Torah upon who is building it. Not just Betzalel, not just Eliyav, but the Chachmei Lev, those who have wisdom. The men come, the women come, and they bring their offerings as well. They weave certain things. So the point is, it's a communal effort, but it also is primarily outside of the half shekel voluntary. The Mishkan in the Chumash is built by volunteers. Maybe come back to that point later. So Betzalel obviously plays a central role, and God says, look here, I have chosen Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur and filled him with wisdom. Now, I thought of looking at two Midrashim, because what the Midrash is doing very often, the Midrash functions in two different ways. The Midrash functions in and of itself. It exists as a body of knowledge in and of itself. And it's interesting to see what the Midrash picks up on and what the Midrash is focusing on, etc. That's one thing. But at the end of the day, the Midrash is written as an interpretation, as it were, on the Chumash. So when you're reading the Midrash, you have to begin with the Chumash, because the Midrash is, at the end of the day, seeing itself as adding something to our understanding of the Torah. The particular two Midrashim that I cited over here, I will pause from time to time to take comments and questions. But the first Midrash, these are both taken from Midrash Rabbi of Shemot. Midrash Rabbi is one of the maybe the greatest collection of Midrashim that we have. And it's on the, Midrash Rabbi is on the Torah and also on the Megillot. And so the first Midrash, which is chapter 48 of Midrash Rabbi, in the third section, talks about the name of Betzalel. He's Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur l'Mate Yehuda. Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur l'Mate Yehuda. So the Midrash is interested on the name. And I'm also interested on the name, and we will say something about the names. So let's start with this Midrash, which is, this is Davar Acher. The Midrash often has many different drashot on one particular topic. Here the topic is Betzalel, great architect of the Mishkan. Davar Acher, Re'u Kara Shem B'Shem, Betzalel ben Uri ben Hur l'Mate Yehuda. So God has chosen Betzalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, from the tribe of Judah. Says the Midrash, Ma ra'a laskir kan Hur. Why do we mention Hur? In other words, the question of the Midrash is, normally in the Torah, you say so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. But you wouldn't say so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the grandson of so-and-so. So why, says the Midrash, mention him in conjunction not just with Uri, his father, but with Hur, his grandfather? That's the Midrash's question. El Bishah, so now the Midrash gives an answer. Now, the answers of the Midrash very often are connected to other Midrashim. Sometimes you have a string of Midrashim that presume knowledge based on a different Midrash, which raises the question how these Midrashim came to be in the first place. It always struck me that the Midrashim that we have, and maybe somebody gave a whole colloquium, a whole set of classes on some topic. Maybe it went on for several hours. And then the different pieces of that lecture become parceled out and become part of different Midrashim. That's what it sounds like from many, many Midrashim. So Maral Haskir Kanchu, why we mention his grandfather for? Elo b'sha'ah, shebikshu Yisrael la'avod avodah zarah. Natan nafsho al kadosh baruch hu v'lo hinichan amdu v'haragu. So the reason is this, says the Midrash. When the Jewish people wanted to worship idols, that is to say, when they made the golden calf. So making the golden calf, or they're about to make the golden calf. Now you remember the story of the golden calf, which we read in this past Shabbat, one of the central stories of the Torah, obviously. Remember that before Moshe is going back up the mountain to receive the tablets and also to get instructions about building the Mishkan. That's why he goes up the mountain. He's there for 40 days. He's to receive information about the Mishkan. All the details, how to build the Mishkan. Moshe goes back up the mountain. And the idea is he's going to come down the mountain with the tablets. And the tablets will be placed in the ark, which is inside the Mishkan. And we will have a happy ending to the book of Exodus. But there's something happens in between. Moshe is up on the mountain. So the people of Moshe is delayed, or they think he's delayed. He's Boshesh, Loredet Minahar. And now this is important. In chapter 24, in Shemot, chapter 24, before Moshe goes up the mountain, in chapter 24, Moshe says to the people, let's find that verse in Exodus chapter 24. So it's the end of chapter 24. Let's find that verse. Let's see where it is. Let's find that verse. Here it is. Chapter 24, verse 14. Moshe said to the elders, you stay here until we return to you. We being himself and Yoshua. Moshe is going up the mountain accompanied by his protege, by his disciple Joshua. You stay here until we return to you. V'nei Aaron v'Chur imachem, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Mibal dvarim yigash aleihem. Anyone who has a dvarim, a legal matter, whoever some kind of a matter, should approach them. So Moshe leaves two people with the people, to Aaron and Hur with the people. You have an issue while I'm gone. I'm going with Joshua, who's going to go with me. Joshua will wait at the foot of the mountain, and Moshe will ascend the mountain to get the tablets and to get the instructions of the Mishkan. And Moshe leaves behind two people, Aaron and Hur. Now, Aaron and Hur are mentioned in chapter 24, but they're also mentioned earlier in the book of Exodus. Where are they mentioned earlier in the book of Exodus? So if you remember, back in chapter 17 of Exodus, when Amalek attacks Israel, Vayavo Amalek, that's the Torah reading for Purim. Amalek came and attacks, and it's very dangerous, and Moshe ascends the mountain. Moshe, Aaron, v'Hur, alu rosh hagiva. Moses, Aaron, and Hur ascend the mountain. And the Torah says a very strange thing in chapter 17. When Moses would lift up his hands, Joshua was fighting the battle down below. He's the commander-in-chief of the army. When Moshe would lift his hands up, Israel would be winning. When he put his hands down, so Amalek would be winning. Moshe kvedim. And Moshe's hands were very heavy, it says, towards the end of chapter 17. By Yichu Evan, they take us a rock, and Moshe sits on the rock. V'Aaron v'Hur tamchu biyadav. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands. There it is, that verse. Mizeh echad u'mizeh echad. This on one side, this on the other side. So Moses' hands remained steady until sunset. So there we encountered the duo of Aaron and Hur. And what's interesting is Moses sitting down with Aaron and Hur, the three of them. It reminds us, actually, the number three sitting together, and especially sitting, Moses is sitting, reminds us of a court. The minimal court in the Talmud is three, and the judges sit. So there's some sense, actually, in the Amalek story that Moshe, Aaron, and Hur are not just there to pray, but in some sense sitting in judgment. That's not a topic for now, but it's very interesting. And I mention this because when Moshe leaves the people temporarily to get the tablets and to get the instructions about the Mishkan, he says to them, I'm going up, we're leaving, but I'm leaving Aaron and Hur with you. Mibal dvarim, anybody who has a davar, which often doesn't mean a legal matter, yigash aleihem, yigash. The word yigash is to approach gingerly, respectfully. Fine. Moses leaves. What happens? So the people see Moshe isn't returning. He's somehow delayed, they think. What do the people do in last week's Parashah? Vayikahel ha'am ala Haron. The people gathered around Aaron, and they said to Aaron, make for us a God that will walk before us. Because the man Moses, he said, Moshe ish, we don't know what happened to him. So the Midrash asks the question, what happened to Hur? Moses had said in chapter 24, I leave Aaron and Hur with you. Whoever has a matter should gingerly approach them. But in chapter 32, the people don't gingerly approach Hur at all. They actually don't gingerly approach Aaron either. They gather about him, trying to intimidate him maybe. And they say, Kum, get up, make for us a God. They don't ask gingerly, they tell him what happened to Hur. Why don't they, where's Hur in the story? He was left behind. So one could have answered, well, they don't go to Hur, because since Aaron is Moses' brother, and he's one of the two main leaders, in the absence of, and they're not asking a legal matter, they're telling him what to do, and he's the boss, he's the number two guy after Moshe, they go to Aaron. But the Midrash has a different answer. The Midrash's answer is that Hur resisted. They actually went to Aaron and Hur tried to stop them. Hur said, no way, there's no golden calf today. And they kill Hur. That's not in the text. That's a Midrash. And the Midrash is based on the fact always have to ask what the Midrash is based on. The Midrash is based on the fact that Chur is not mentioned, even though Moshe left Chur behind. So, given the fact that they're trying to intimidate Aaron, says the Midrash, they probably tried to intimidate Chur, but Chur, unlike Aaron, is not going to put up with it. So Chur resisted, and Chur was killed. That's what the Midrash assumes, that Chur is killed trying to prevent the building of the making of the golden calf. By the way, when you say that Chur is killed, just as a side point, was with the Midrash, you always want to ask yourself the question, what is the Midrash implying over here? And I think that maybe the Midrash could be implying one of two things. It could be saying, well, Chur stood up and was killed, and Aaron didn't. Aaron makes the golden calf. Maybe that looks bad for Aaron. Or the Midrash could be saying the opposite, that actually, in defense of Aaron, Aaron said to himself, what's the point? If I resist it, they'll just kill me, and maybe they'll make it themselves or whatever. So when he sees that Chur is killed by the people, he sees that the people are intent on this to the degree they're willing to kill Chur. So he says to himself, to simply resist is not going to work. Maybe I'll try a different tactic. And then the question is what Aaron did. Is he trying to delay them, trying to stall them? These are various Midrashim. The truth of the matter, the bottom line is Aaron made the golden calf, and that's a very bad thing. But the Midrashim typically try to add nuance. And the nuance of the Midrash's finding is often in the text. That's one of the things in studying Midrash. You try to see what is the Midrash picking up on in the text. It's not going to whitewash Aaron. On the other hand, it's always more complicated than it may seem on the surface. In any event, that's the assumption of our Midrash. Right, so let's read this again now about Betzalel. Now, Betzalel is Chur's grandson. They're assuming that it's the same Chur, that the Chur that Moses left behind is the grandfather of Betzalel. That's what the Midrash is assuming. So let's see what it says. Ma'arol Asher Kan Chur. Back to the Midrash in chapter 48, section 3. So Chur gave up his life for the honor of God. And he's going to stop them. And the people rose up and they killed him. God says, Chayecha means by your life, means I swear. I swear, says God, I'm going to repay you. I'm going to repay you for your good deed. Mashal melech shamadu alav l'gyonotav. Now the Midrash often has a parable, and very often in the Midrash, the parables involve a king. So a king whose armies rebelled against him. But his general stood up and fought the soldiers. So what, you're going to rebel against the king? So they rose up and they killed the general. Amar Hamelech, Ilu Mamo Natan Li Lo Yiti Tzarich Lefrolo, Alachat Kama V'Kama Shenafsho Natan Olai. How much more so if he had just given me money, I'd have to repay my debt. How much more so that he gave up his life? Mani Yosala, but what can I do for him? He's dead. How can I do anything for him? And we'll call Bonim Sheyetzu Mimenu Ani Mamidam to Kasim Aparchim. Kach Bishah She'asa Yisrael Ha'egel. Omar Chur V'Natan Nafsho Al Kadosh Baruch Hu. Omaro Chayecha Kol Bonim Hayotzim Mimcha Ani Megadlam Shem Tov Ba'olam Shenemar Ru'u Kara Hashem B'Shem B'Tzalel Vayimalei Oto Ruach Elohim V'Lozel Bilvad. And we'll call Mishnit Asek B'Mlechet HaMishkan Natan Ba'Kadosh Baruch Hu Chachma U'Bida Vadat. So the marshal is, since Chur had given up his life for the glory, for the honor of God, so God says, I have to repay him. And how can I repay Chur? He's dead. So I'm going to repay his children. His descendants, I'm going to treat his descendants with honor because it's a debt that I owe. That's how the Midrash formulates it. If he had given me money, I have to repay it. So I have a debt. So it's interesting, by the way, that's the Midrash. but lies behind the Midrash. There's always something that lies behind the Midrash. The same as the Midrash sees things that lie behind the Chumash. When we're studying Midrash, we always ask ourselves the question, what lies behind the Midrash? And what lies behind this Midrash is clearly that the Midrash sees some kind of a connection between the golden calf on one hand and the Mishkan on the other. It's interesting. What is the connection between the golden calf and the Mishkan? So they are similar. They are both physical representations. Maybe representation is the wrong word, but they're physical objects which suggest the presence of God. And it's very interesting to note that there's a great dispute between Rashi on the Torah and the Ramban about the Mishkan. Because the Ramban's position, not the Ramban, Rashi's position, and he states this in Kitisa, in last week's Parashah, is that the Torah is not in order, not in chronological order, and that in fact, the command to build the Mishkan, says Rashi, was only given after the episode of the golden calf, which is not the way we read the Chumash. The order of the Chumash is the command to build the Mishkan is chapters 25 through 31. The golden calf is chapters 32, 33, 34. And the building of the Mishkan is 35, this week's Parashah, Vayakil. But Rashi, in general, argues that the Torah, while it is in order, is not necessarily in chronological order. So for Rashi, what the Mishkan is for Rashi, it sounds like, is a kosher golden calf. The Ramban disagrees. The Ramban thinks no, it's not a kosher. For Rashi, the Mishkan is a concession. People need something physical, because if they really would understand, we wouldn't need anything physical. We wouldn't need a Mishkan. But Rashi says we don't understand, as evidenced by the golden calf episode, and the people need. So in the golden calf, it was the goal to build the golden calf. But in the Mishkan, it's the very gold, the same gold, to build the Mishkan. One could go even beyond this and make the following observation, that the gold that was used to build the golden calf was gold that was taken from the land of Egypt, because the Torah says that when we left Egypt, the Egyptians gave us presents, among the presents were gold and silver. And that gold we used to build the golden calf. So it means that the golden calf is somehow a throwback to being slaves in Egypt, or to being part of the culture of Mitzrayim. And then at the end of it, we sort of repent. That's last week's Parashah. That's the story of the Parashah Kitisa. And then the very same gold is used to build the Mishkan. So in the process of repentance, it said last week that after the golden calf, the people took off their jewelry and set it aside. They distanced themselves from the golden calf, from Egypt. And then in this week's Parashah, we are taking that very gold and sanctifying the gold by using that very gold that we took from Egypt, and now we're building the Mishkan. In any event, the Midrash is picking up on the connection between the golden calf on one hand and the building of the Mishkan on the other. But the Midrash does it midrashically by linking it in terms of chur. And it's a very interesting point. When you read the Chumash, you say to yourself, you know something? It could even be the pshat, that it's the same chur. That's part of the point. That, I mean, chur is not, it doesn't say that chur resisted, but it does say that chur was left behind, and minimally he disappears in the story. That chur represents justice and judgment. And over here it's chur, who is the grandfather of the one who builds the Mishkan. Let me stop here for a moment and take comments or questions about this first Midrash, if there are any.
I'm not sure we have any comments or questions in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to say anything.
Okay, we'll move on. We don't have to ask questions. Okay, so that's the first Midrash I wanted to look at. The next Midrash is also, but by the way, let me just add something to what the Midrash says, which probably is also behind the Midrash as well. And that is the
Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
Silber, sorry to
Yes.
interrupt, but I was going to say that the Atzei Shitim, that the wood surrounds the gold, because that was something more natural, something malleable that can change, with time. So it wasn't just the zahav that they used.
Right. It's actually typically the gold surrounds the wood. The vessels are made out of wood. The gold is on top of the wood. Yeah, for sure. Right. But the gold is very clear. And I'll tell you something else. In terms of the vessels of the Mishkan in general, and the Mishkan in general, the holier the object, the more gold it has. There are different gradations of sanctity. So the holiest things have the gold, and the less holy things have silver, and the less holy things have copper. So, but yes, of course, it's not just gold. That's certainly the case. I just want to add one thing to the Midrash over here about Hur. The Midrash is focusing on Hur, but there's also interesting, Hur's the grandfather. His name is Betzalel, his second name is, and his father's name is Uri. And what's interesting is, now there are Midrashim that talk about the name Uri. A lot of Midrashim that focus on Uri. And what they talk about, the Midrashim, is that the Uri, of course, the word Uri, Aleph Vav, Resh Yud, within the word Uri, we have the word Or. And that, in fact, what Betzalel is doing is creating this sacred space in which God is living, right? God says, "V'yasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham," I will dwell amongst them. So Betzalel is creating a little world in which God is present. But the Midrashim and the Kabbalistic texts run with this idea. The Mishkan is a kind of mini world that the human being creates together with God. God gives the instructions. But the first creation of the world, that's found in the very beginning of the Torah. And the first created thing is the light. Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or. Vayehi Or. So the Midrashim on Parashah Vayakel and elsewhere play with this idea that Betzalel ben Uri, that picking up on the idea that the Mishkan is a kind of mini world. And when you think about it, there's a lot to be said for the Mishkan being the mini world, because in conjunction with the Mishkan, for example, both in the instructions in chapter 31 and the building of the Mishkan beginning in chapter 35, appended to the Mishkan, building of the Mishkan, is the mitzvah of Shabbat. Shabbat is found at the end of the instructions in chapter 31, V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat. That's the last thing that's stated over there. And in this week's Parashah, before you get to the building of the Mishkan, the first few verses, Vayakel Moshe, and Moshe gathered all the people, and he said, Sheish yamim te'aseh melacha, you can work for 6 days, or the 7th day is the holy Shabbat. So Shabbat and the Mishkan are tied together, both in the instructions and in the actual building. And of course, Shabbat is the capstone of creation in the first chapter of the Torah. The first creative thing is the Or. And I would add to this I don't know, it's probably in the Midrashim as well. The Midrash sees a million things. But I would add something else. Apart from the Shabbat, and apart from the fact that the light was the first created thing, what was the last created thing? First created thing is the light, the Or, Uri. What is the first create? What is the last created thing? What is the last thing that God creates before God rests on Shabbat? The last created thing in the first chapter of the Torah is the human being. And what does God say about the human being? Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. The human being is created b'tzelem Elohim, in the image of God, shadow of God. So the man's name is B'Tzelel, in God's shadow, or God's image, Tselem. So his name is, I would say, B'Tzelel's name is the last thing that God created, the son of the first thing that God created. So the idea that the Mishkan is essentially, one might say, the culmination of creation, the successful completion of creation, which actually can last. It's a creation, unlike the first creation, which God does alone. This is a creation that God and the human being together, we are partners with God in building the Mishkan. God gives the instructions, the artisans, the volunteers build it, and this is the thing that lasts. The one who emphasized this point, that the Mishkan, unlike the first creation was God's creation. And that world that God created, that Tov and Ki Tov and Tov Ma'od, that world doesn't exist. That world didn't work. But the world that does work, the Mishkan, which can live anyway, is one which is a partnership. The person that emphasized that in Israelis very much was Martin Buber, emphasized that point. But anyway, my point is that the Midrash that we just read together talks about Uri. It talks about the Hur. But in point of fact, other Midrashim, many Midrashim have a drush on the name Uri on Or, and I added my 2 cents, which I'm sure you could find in other Midrashim as well, someplace or other, on B'tzal El, B'tselem Elohim. So it all goes back to creation, which is a very important point, because the truth of the matter is that the Torah, which begins with the creation of the world, and the book of Exodus is concluding with the creation of the Mishkan. And of course, what the Midrash understands very well is that a lot of the language of creation, both the first creation story and the second, are found in conjunction with the Mishkan, not just Shabbos, many things. Okay, that's the first Midrash. That's 48:3. And now let's take a look at 48:4. Take a look at 48:4. So the Midrash asks them, all of this praise that Bezalel gets, where is he getting it from? Why is it Bezalel that's being chosen over here? Chochma, Tvuna, Uvedat. Right? Bezalel ben Uri ben Hur. Bezalel ben Uri ben Hur Lumate Yehuda. So the Midrash comments, Minayin lo mishevet Yehuda. So the Midrash is saying, what is it about the tribe of Judah? Bezalel is from the tribe of Judah. It's from mishevet Yehuda. So this great wisdom that he got, where is this coming from? From where does he get all of this wisdom? Says the Midrash, surprisingly, Bizchut Miriam. He gets it from Miriam. Miriam represents wisdom. Now, we have an extremely complicated drush over here. As I said before, one Midrash plays off another Midrash. I do believe that someone gave a shiur or something, maybe it was a long shiur, with 20 different Midrashim, all kinds of connections. And then when this is written down, it gets parceled out to different places. But it presumes knowledge of other Midrash. So here we have the following thought. Shenemar, it says in the first chapter of the book of Exodus, Vayas lahem batim, that God made for them batim, houses. What is that? What is that referring to? So that's the story of the midwives of chapter 1 of Exodus, the Miyaldot. In the first chapter of Shemot, Paro is trying to limit the birth rate of the Jewish people, and he ends up instructing. At one point, he instructs the midwives that who are there to assist the Jewish women giving birth, that if they see it's a boy, they should make sure the boy does not live. On the other hand, if it's a girl, keep her alive. And we're told, and he instructs us to the Miyaldota Ivriyot, the Hebrew midwives, Asher Shem Ha'achat Shifra, V'Shem Hashenit Pua. What is named Shifra and what is named Pua? But the Torah tells us that the midwives did not listen because they feared God. And the Torah then says in chapter 1 of Exodus, Vayaki Yardu Hamiyaldota et Elohim, and because the midwives feared God, Vayas lahem batim, God made for them houses. So it's very, very interesting. What does that mean? Who are these midwives? And what does it mean God made for them houses? So now we have the Midrash steps in. First of all, let's make the first point the Midrash assumes is that Miyaldot or Ivriyot does not necessarily mean those that birthed the Hebrews, because those that birthed the Hebrews, some Mepharshim say probably they're not Jewish altogether. Why would Pharaoh instruct the Hebrew midwives to make sure that the boys don't live? Probably they're Egyptian midwives. And mialdot is a verb, those who cause, those who enable the Hebrews to give birth. That's a possibility in the text, but the Midrash says otherwise. The Midrash says, first of all, they're Jewish. The midwives are Jewish. And Shifra and Pua, actually, which actually is probably not even names, those that beautify and those that soothe the child, Shifra and Pua, the Midrash identifies them with two other women who appear in the very next story. And the two other women that appear in the next story are the mother and the sister of Moshe. Now, in the next chapter, chapter 2 of Exodus, it never names them. But since we know Moses' mother is named Yocheved, and we know Moses has a sister named Miriam, the Midrash assumes that the two women that appear in the beginning of chapter 2 of Exodus are identical to the two women who appear at the end of chapter 1 of Exodus, namely Shifra and Pua, who are Yocheved and Miriam. Fine. So they are God-fearing, and they refuse to listen to Pharaoh's command, and they make an excuse. Pharaoh says, what's going on? How come they're living? And all the Hebrew women give birth very, very quickly. Chayotein, they always give birth before we arrive. So what can we do? So the Torah says, because they fear God, and were God-fearing, means they have their own set of rules. They listen to God's voice, not to Pharaoh. Vayas lahem batim, God made for them houses. So what does that mean, God made for them houses? A fancy condominium? What did God make for them? So the Midrash says, another Midrash, Vayas lahem batim, mehoyu habatim, beis kahuna ubeit hamalchut. So God gave that their descendants will have priesthood, kahuna, and malchut, and kingship. So how does this work now? Notice, none of this is in the text. But our Midrash is relying upon other Midrashim. So how does this work? And where is the priesthood? Because priesthood and kingship are batim, the houses, because they pass down from generation to generation. They are hereditary. They pass on from usually from father to son. So Yocheved, not to a kahuna or malchut. So Yocheved, the mother, she got the blessing of kahuna and malchut. How'd she get kahuna and malchut? Aaron Kohen Gadol, her son Aaron, was the high priest, and Moshe Melech. Moshe had the role of a king. Shenemar, as is written in Devarim, Vayihi Bishurun Melech. That in Israel, in Yeshurun, that's Israel, there was a king. The plain reading of it, the king is God. But the Midrash states Melech, there is actually a king, and it's Moses. So that's what Yocheved got. She got Batim. She got Kahuna and Malchut, the two institutions in Israel that passed down generation to generation. Miriam not to a Chachma. So what did Miriam get? If Yocheved got Kahuna and Malchut, what did Miriam get? Miriam not to a Chachma. She'amida b'tzalel. V'yatzla mimenu David. Shehaya melech. Shenemar. And now we have this convoluted proof that Miriam is the great-great-great-grandmother of King David. How is that going to work? Because King David is from Judah and Miriam is from the tribe of Levi. So there's a very complicated set of Midrashim here that try to demonstrate that King David, Batim, because again, kingship passes down from generation to generation, but specifically, she got the gift of wisdom. She got the gift of Chachma. And now I'll just run through what the Midrash tries to prove this, that David comes from Miriam. Shenemar, but Lo Ephrat and Chur. Ephrat is taken by a different Midrash, the name Ephrat, to refer to Miriam. Let's leave that aside. Uchtiv v'David ben Ish Ephrati. Shabba min Miriam, shenikret Ephrat. Okay. So this is so notice the number of Midrashim that are linked over here. Okay, so Shevet Yehuda B'Tzalel, who has the wisdom, the Chachma, the Bina, and the Dat, this comes from Miriam, who was given the gift of wisdom. Okay. Now, by the way, just as an aside, and then I'll pause and take some questions or comments before we finish up this Midrash. Notice that the Midrash is doing something else over here, in addition to everything else. What the Midrash is picking up on, what the Midrash is doing, is the Midrash is tied. Parashat Vayakel is the building of the Mishkan, and the building of the Mishkan is both Parashat Vayakel and Parashat Pekudei. It's the end of the book. And notice what the Midrash is doing over here. It links Betzalel to the midwives. Well, not named, but midrashically, the Miriam and Yocheved. So in a sense, what it's doing, and it often does, it's linking the beginning of the book to the end of the book. The beginning of the book to the end of the book. And the idea of Vayas Lahem Batim, they were given houses, houses, bayit. One of the houses that we have in our tradition is the Beit HaMikdash. So it sees Miriam herself, and then through a descendant David, through a complicated midrashic maneuver, it's saying that the Batim in the beginning, in the first chapter of this book, one of the ways that the Batim plays out is in the building of the Bayit, right? The Mishkan is God's house, is God's Bayit. The permanent Mishkan is called the Beit HaMikdash. It's a house, it's a Bayit. So the Midrash is always has a wide view of the book, and it's connecting the beginning of the book to the end of the book. Just to support this idea, when you think about the beginning of the book, which is chapter 1, well, the beginning, of course, is chapter 1, but in the beginning of the book, remember that Paro instructs the Israelites to build. They build Arei Miskinot with Paro, Pitom and Ramsey. They build the Arei Miskinot. Not that Paro actually cares about the buildings. He doesn't. He wants to break the people down, to break their will down, to frustrate them. Later on, to even take away the straw. They can't even build what they're supposed to build. So it's building with no purpose. Arei Miskinot. And maybe there's even a play on Mishkan and Mishkan. But the end of the book, in the building of the Mishkan, with Betzalel, it's Lachshov Machshavot. It's thought out work. It's what the Gemara calls Melechet Machshevet. So the contrast between working for Pharaoh, when you're a slave of Paro, an eved of Paro, your work has no meaning. But when you build God's house, God's bayit, that's very different. First of all, you have a Shabbat. You don't work every day. Twice the Torah emphasizes don't work on Shabbat. Shabbat is different. And on top of that, it's Melechet Machshevet. Everything has a purpose, which is why when it comes to the Mishkan, it's built by volunteers. People are anxious. People don't mind working hard if there's a purpose. When there's no purpose, who wants to work? But when there is a purpose, they work very hard. The Midrash is in this spirit. What Midrash does is it gets us to see things with a much broader lens. It says what happens in chapter 1 and what happens at the end of the book are actually tied together and to be contrasted. Okay, before I complete the Midrash over here, does anybody have any comments or questions about what we've seen so far in terms of this Midrash about Betzalel?
I actually noticed that we have so I also go to another Drisha class by Rabbi Leah Sana on a Wednesday, which is about the Meneket Rivka, which is a really, really amazing book, one of the first books written by a Jewish woman for Jewish women in the kind of real Torah world, not academia, not stories. And we're reading the introduction to the book, and the Meneket Rivka goes on a big kind of homily about this exact midrash, and she goes through all the other times that batim and also the verb to build are related to women, and it was really, really an incredible read. And so it's so lovely that this has come up twice in a week in a Drisha class, and it's also just great to hear the midrash from another perspective. Wow. Right, I love it when Torah comes together.
Right, the Midrash is very, very interesting in general, because what the Midrash is doing, in my view, the Midrash is not claiming that the plain reading of the text is not valid. the Midrash presumes that the plain reading is valid. What the Midrash picks up on, by focusing on parallels, by focusing on particular formulations of language, Midrash is picking up on something that's very important, which is that stories have main lines and secondary lines, but there's all kinds of other things bubbling just beneath the surface. It's like a piece of music. You have all kinds, and the Midrash is are very good readers. They're very sensitive to the language, and they're telling us, in addition to the shot or maybe one main interpretation or two, there are all kinds of other resonances in the text and all kinds of linkage of the text. So but here the Midrash is connecting the Batim of chapter 1 to the Mishkan of chapters 35. I mean, the Mishkan takes up 12, 13 chapters in this book. Mm-hmm. It's about 30% of the book is about the Mishkan.
The Meneket Rivka also connects it to a different Midrash, which is about the side of the Mishkan, and the fact that that the woman was built from the tzad. It's very interesting. But I think Jennifer also had.
Yes, that's the Midrash about it with Selah HaMishkan, and the Torah says that God took Achad Mitzalotav vayistor basar tachtena. So the Midrash, presumably, I don't know what Meneket Rivka says about it, but that's exactly what the Midrash would do, and they would, and you could say many things about that. Since you mentioned it, I would make the following observation about the Mishkan, which is that the key vessel of the Mishkan is the ark. In fact, there are many Midrashim, but the first thing B'Tzalel makes, Vayas B'Tzalel et Haron. Above the ark, sitting on top of the ark, are these two cherubs, the Kruvim. They face each other. And one of these Kruvim, these children or whatever, so according to some Midrashim, one is a male and one's female. And they face each other, and they kind of embrace each other. And God speaks from in between. In the space between, God is speaking. And the idea is, reading this recently, that actually the idea of the Mishkan, the big idea of the Mishkan, is to, of course, it's a place where we receive God's commandment, but it's also a place of intimacy with God. And the idea of the religious life is that one idea of the religious life is that one feels deeply connected to the divine. One feels the embrace of the divine, etc. And that's what the Mishkan represents. Apart from all the rules and the regulations and all that, there's something about the very relationship itself. And from that perspective, it makes total sense of the tzela, because the idea of the idea, it doesn't always work out that way, but the idea is that the Ezer Kenegdo, that the man and the woman, especially one person, that somehow are deeply connected to each other. Each one is different, obviously, but there's some kind of a very deep connection. So the Mishkan ideally, I say ideally, represents this notion that God and the individual person, or the people of Israel in some cases, are deeply connected to each other. There's a deep love and a deep commitment and a deep trust. The idea of covenant, basically. Of course, when it doesn't work, things get, when there's betrayal and that kind of thing, there's deep anger also. But the fact of the matter is, so maybe that's what the tzela, if I had to connect the tzela, that's where I would take it. I think that's a very important, especially given the Kruvim as being, the ark is the central vessel, and the Kruvim are above the ark and the place in which God speaks. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, let me just finish this Midrash now. We have about 5 more minutes. So let's just continue a little more with this. So what do we have over here? Let's see. Yes. So a little more. Right. So let's. The world was created with these 3 things. Shenemar, Hashem b'chachma yasad eretz konein shamayim b'tfuna b'dato talmot nivkal. God created the world with these things, with chachma, with bina, and with dat. And that's the way. And ub'shlosh devarim nasa mishkan. And with the same 3 things, God created the Mishkan. Shenemar v'amalel ruach Elohim b'chachma b'tfuna u'v'dat. Ub'shlosha devarim halo nivna beit hamikdash. Shenemar ben isha almanahu maten aftali v'yimalei et hachachma v'et hatfuna v'et hadat. So we have the idea of what I mentioned before, that chachma, tevuna, and dat, these three elements of wisdom, are present in the creation of the world. They're present in Betzalel, who builds the Mishkan, and they're present in the Beit HaMikdash. And the point of it, for our purposes, would be to, when you're reading these parashiot, Vayaku and Pekudei, to think of it in terms of creation. And this is the ultimate goal of creation, was to create a space in which God and the human being can share. And actually, when you think about it, more than the first chapter of the Torah, it really is the second story of the Torah. It's the story of the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden was a place where God is walking in the garden, where God places the human being, God's beloved creation, to work and to guard, terms that are used in the Torah in conjunction with the Mishkan. So the Midrash is picking up on something very important. It's telling us, when you read these parashiot, Vayaku and Pekudei, don't think about them only in of themselves, but see the bigger picture. And I would say there are two bigger pictures. I'll conclude with the thought of what the Midrash is telling us. One bigger picture is to see it as the culmination of the book of Exodus, which begins with Batim, which begins with work with no purpose. That's one way to read these parashiot. But the Midrash has a very broad lens, and the Midrash says it's not just to see it as the culmination of the book of Exodus, but see it as the culmination of the whole Torah to this point, which begins with creation. That the purpose of creation was to have a space in which God and the human can dwell together. That requires how to do that requires a lot of thought, a lot of wisdom, a lot of insight. And the Mishkan is that space. The Mishkan is one of the alternatives to the Garden of Eden, where God and the human being can dwell together. I will just conclude with the following observation about, since we talked about Betzalel, his name, his father's name, his grandfather's name, and then we also talked about Shevet Yehuda. He comes from Judah, Miriam, and the wisdom of Miriam. And I would add one detail to this, which is, I have filled them with the Spirit of God. And Ruach Elohim can mean many different things. But one of the people that is filled with Ruach Elohim in the Chumash, apart from Betzalel, is actually Yosef. Yosef is filled with Ruach Elohim. Pharaoh said it. Can we find another person who was filled with the Spirit of God? And actually, if we think about Ruach Elohim, there are different kinds of wisdom. There are many aspects to wisdom. Some people have one kind of wisdom and not a different kind of wisdom. There's many different kinds of wisdom. But I'll mention one thing that Betzalel and Yosef have in common. And that is what Betzalel's insight is about. People give Betzalel a lot of materials, a lot of gifts to Betzalel. And Betzalel has the wisdom to know how to take the raw materials, and from the raw materials to fashion a very beautiful space for God. And that's what Joseph is able to do. Joseph is told there's going to be X amount of produce, 7 lean years and 7 years of plenty. And the wisdom of Joseph is to take the crops that grow over 14 years and to use them in the most effective way to sustain the country. You can't just eat the first 7 years crop. You have to store it up, you have to save it, you have to parcel it out, etc. So the ability to take goods, to take things, and to use them in the most efficient and effective way, that's one element of the Ruach Elohim that is common both to Joseph and to Betzalel. So I think I'll stop at this point. It's pinch hitting today. But anyway, the Midrash is so rich, and there's so much to say about it. What I tried to show is how the Midrash here can be seen as, in addition to what it says in general, as being interpretive, and to point us in directions for a deeper understanding of this week's Parashah in the context of what came before it, in the context of the book of Exodus, taking us back to the Batim and Miriam, and of course in the context of creation of the world, that the Mishkan is the human partnering with God to create a sacred space. That's what this week's Parashiot are all about. Anyway, thank you very much. It's a pleasure, and I guess we'll stop at this point. Does anybody have a last comment?
I just want to say thank you so very much, because you were pinch hitting after a richly informed lecture, an hour and a half or two ago, and the connections you make are just fascinating. I'm thrilled
Okay.
each and every time, so I thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, great.
Thank you,
all.
Rabbi Silber. Toda
Okay.
Rabba.
Okay, next week we have the Rappaport lecture.
Yes. So before everyone runs off, I have some announcements that are very relevant to this class next week. So next week we have the Rappaport Memorial Lecture at 12 o'clock Eastern. It's going to be a really amazing shir to get us ready for Pesach. It's going to be about the Seder. You should definitely be there. But this class is going to be half an hour later because of that. So normally we're at 1 p.m. Eastern. Next week we're going to be at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. So that is what you need to know. Thank you so much, Rabbi Silber, for that incredible last minute class. And as always, thank you so much to our participants for the amazing comments and questions and learning. So I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Toda Rabba.